Are you going to hurt me too? 7 words, barely a whisper. From a child hiding behind a laundromat dryer at 10 o'clock at night, barefoot, 7 years old, 38 pounds, soaking wet. And she'd already learned to ask that question before she asked anything else. For 11 months, Addie Mae Pruett had been trying to tell someone what was happening to her. She told her teacher. She walked into a police station alone. She stood at a neighbor's door in the rain. Every single time, the adults around her found a reason to look away. Every single time, the system that was supposed to protect her picked up the phone and called the man who was hurting her instead. But on the night of October 14th, in a coin laundromat on Lafayette Avenue in Moundsville, West Virginia, a 7-year-old girl reached into her coat pocket and held out a folded piece of notebook paper to the largest, most terrifying-looking man she had ever seen in her life. And Virgil Cole, 6'2", 230 pounds, 3-inch scar from jaw to collarbone, 22 years wearing the Hell's Angels patch, got down on one knee on a cold linoleum floor and read every word. What happened next would move 73 men to ride through the night. And what they found inside Douglas Merritt's house would eventually put him in a federal courtroom facing charges that would take a prosecutor 45 minutes just to read aloud. This is Addie's story. And it doesn't end the way the system planned. If you believe every child deserves someone who answers, subscribe to Valiant Biker and tell me what city you're watching from in the comments below. Stay with me. We're going back to that laundromat right now. I have been waiting for the right person. Are you safe? I have something important to tell someone. That was what the note said. She had written it 3 weeks earlier, in second-grade pencil, so worn the letters were almost gone. She had folded it into a square the size of a matchbook, and kept it in the inside pocket of her yellow raincoat, against her ribs, where it would stay dry. She had carried it every single day since then, waiting, not hoping. She had stopped hoping. She was waiting, the way you wait when you have learned that hope costs something you cannot afford to spend anymore. Her name was Addie Mae Pruett. She was 7 years old. She weighed 38 pounds. A healthy 7-year-old girl should weigh 50. The 12-pound difference was not genetics, not a growth disorder, not a sensitive stomach the way her guardian told the school. It was a padlock on a refrigerator. It was a behavior chart on the kitchen wall, where most days came up yellow or red, and red days meant the dinner portion was halved. It was 11 months of a system designed to feed and shelter children, instead being used as a tool to make one child small enough, weak enough, dependent enough that she could not fight back. She wore a faded yellow raincoat 2 sizes too large. Brown corduroy pants frayed at the knees. Both sleeves pulled down over her hands, the left one doing extra work, hiding the place where her forearm had healed, crooked, the bone set wrong because Douglas Merritt had removed the cast himself 9 weeks ago. Told the school the doctor said it was fine. The doctor said no such thing. Douglas had simply decided that doctors ask questions, and questions were a problem he had solved by becoming the only person Addie was allowed to see alone. She had gray eyes that moved the way eyes move in rooms where things get thrown without warning. They checked every exit before they settled. They looked at hands first, always hands, because hands were what told you what was coming before anything else did. She had a small scar through her left eyebrow, a bruise on her right cheekbone, yellow-green now, 11 days old, still mapping the path from purple-black to gone. 4 marks on her inner left wrist that matched adult finger spacing with a precision that would make a forensic examiner set down their coffee and pick up a camera. And she was alone in a coin laundromat at 9:52 on a Tuesday night in October, 41 degrees outside and dropping, tucked into the gap behind the last dryer in the far row, back to the wall, knees to her chest, counting ceiling tiles. Counting was how she stayed in control of something. She had been counting down for 3 weeks. 31 days. 30. 29. She didn't know exactly what happened on day 0, only that she had heard the word Clarksburg and the word fee and the phrase same as with Tammy. And she did not know who Tammy was, but she knew from the way Douglas said it that Tammy was not somewhere better. She had come here because she had nowhere else. Before Addie reached the far row, 3 other people had already decided she was not their problem. The first was a young mother loading laundry into a canvas bag, 2 kids hanging off a grocery cart. She saw Addie's face when Addie looked up from behind the center row machines. The instinct was there. You could see it, that split-second pause, the almost. Then she looked back at her own children, pulled the bag onto her shoulder, and walked out faster than she walked in. In the parking lot, she took out her phone, not to call for help, to text someone. What she texted, nobody would ever know for certain. What she did not do was come back inside. The second was a night shift worker in his 30s, steel-toed boots still on, half asleep over his phone in a plastic chair. Addie moved close enough to be seen. He noticed. He told her, without looking up, that the laundromat closed at 10 and she should go home. She said quietly that she didn't want to go home. He put his earbuds back in. I want to say something directly here, before we go further. None of the 3 people who turned away from Addie that night were evil. The young mother, the night shift worker, the laundromat owner. Each of them made the same calculation that millions of people make every day. The calculation that says, this is not my situation to enter. That says, someone else will handle it. That says, I could be wrong, and being wrong would be embarrassing, and embarrassment is a cost I'm not willing to pay for a child I don't know. We have built, quietly and without intending to, a society where the default response to a child alone at night is to find a reason she belongs to someone else. The question worth sitting with is not why those 3 people failed Addie. The question is what we each do the next time we feel that calculation starting. He heard her say it. He chose, in that specific moment, not to have heard it. The third was harder. The owner of the laundromat, Marta Kovac, 57 years old, had been running this place for 19 years. She was locking up the back office when she found Addie in the gap behind the dryer. She was not unkind about it. She crouched down. She asked, in a reasonable voice, what Addie's guardian's name was. When Addie said Douglas Merritt, something shifted in Marta's face. Not suspicion, not alarm. Recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from a name that has explained itself enough times in this town to no longer require explanation. Oh, she's Doug Merritt's foster kid. And Marta reached for her phone. Addie bolted to the far corner. She had learned 11 months ago what it meant when an adult picked up a phone after hearing that name. She was still in the far corner, back to the wall, when the 4th people came. 2 men in yellow safety vests, neighborhood watch, flashlights, and clipboards, doing their nightly pass through the commercial strip. They found her within 2 minutes. One of them crouched the way adults crouched when they were about to deliver news you hadn't asked for. "Honey," he said, "Mr. Merritt's been worried sick. He's one of the good ones, runs the whole county foster board. You ought to be grateful." He had his radio in his hand before she could answer. Here is something most people never learn about how abuse survives inside systems designed to stop it. A smart abuser does not win by becoming invisible. He wins by becoming the person everyone calls when there is a problem. Douglas Merritt did not need to hide. He needed only to be the first number in every contact field. The teacher's emergency line, the caseworker's follow-up call, the neighborhood watch radio check. Every institution meant to protect Addie had been quietly rewired to root back to him. Not through conspiracy, through paperwork, through certification seminars and committee chairs, and the slow accumulation of a reputation so solid that his name, spoken aloud, functioned as a closing argument. That is what made him dangerous. Not that he was unknown, that he was trusted. And that was when Addie Mae Pruett understood, with the cold clarity of a 7-year-old who had already exhausted every adult within reach, that she had approximately 8 minutes before Douglas Merritt walked through that door. She went to the far row. She got behind the last dryer. She put her back to the wall and her knees to her chest, and she started counting ceiling tiles again. And she waited for the right person. Virgil Cole had been coming to Lucky Spin on Tuesday nights for 11 years. He owned Cole's Garage on Route 2, which meant his work clothes got the kind of dirty that a regular washing machine gave up on. He came late when the place was empty, because 6'2" with a Hell's Angels cut and a 3-inch facial scar had a way of making people in laundromats suddenly remember somewhere else they needed to be. He'd stopped taking it personally around year 3. He was loading the last dryer when his hand stopped. He hadn't heard anything. He'd felt the change in the air the way you feel a room shift when something in it is watching you. 22 years of riding through towns where being wrong about your surroundings had consequences had wired him for exactly this. The awareness that the room he thought was empty was not. He turned slowly, looked at the gap between the machine and the wall. Gray eyes looked back at him. Open. Still. They had been watching his hands since the moment he turned around. He didn't move. He understood, without being told, that moving was the wrong thing to do. The child stood up. She reached into her coat pocket and held out a closed fist. She opened it. In her palm, a hospital bracelet, 9 weeks old, the ink faded, but the barcode still crisp. Pruett, Addie Mae. New Medicine, Reynolds Memorial, Pediatrics. And beneath it, a square of notebook paper, folded 4 times, the fold lines soft from weeks of being opened and closed. She unfolded the note herself, held it up so he could read it. I have been waiting for the right person. Are you safe? I have something important to tell someone. Virgil Cole read it twice. He took off his reading glasses, folded them, put them in his breast pocket. The specific, deliberate slowness of a man choosing how to use the next 30 seconds with enormous care. Then he lowered himself to one knee on the linoleum floor. 6'2", 230 pounds. A man whose scar made strangers cross the street. And he put both hands flat on the cold floor, palms facing up, open. An old gesture from a time when he'd had to approach frightened things in difficult places. I'm not holding anything. Look. See? He looked at her face. She was still watching his hands. Are you going to hurt me too? 9 words, barely above the hum of the dryers. He would remember later that the word that hit hardest was too. Not are you going to hurt me, a reasonable fear from a child alone at night. 2. 1 word that contained 11 months. 1 word that told him everything the note hadn't said out loud. That she had already asked this question in different ways, to different people, and the answer had always been yes. He did not rush the silence. He let her watch his hands. No, he said. Nobody's going to hurt you tonight. Not a promise. A fact. The specific difference between the two was something in his voice she had apparently been listening for, because something in her face shifted. Not relaxation, not relief, nothing that simple. But the slight change of a dial moving 1 degree toward a setting she had not been able to find for 11 months. He did not touch her. He stayed on the floor. My name's Virgil, he said. This is my regular Tuesday. I'm not in any hurry. You can stand there as long as you need to. She stood there for 40 seconds. He counted. Then she sat down cross-legged on the floor across from him, still out of arm's reach, the note held in both hands in her lap. The hospital bracelet she put back in her pocket. He's going to come here, she said. They called him. How long do we have? She thought about it with the precision of someone who had been calculating windows of time for months. Maybe 7 minutes, maybe less. Virgil nodded. Then let's use them. What she told him in those 7 minutes, he would later describe to his chapter as the most careful testimony he had ever received. Not because it was detailed, it was, surgically so, but because of how she delivered it. She started small, the way trauma teaches you to, when you have learned that big truths get you sent back. I left without permission, she said. He's going to be very angry. I don't want to go back, but I don't have anywhere else. 22 words. Surface layer. Just enough to see if he'd flinch. He didn't flinch. He locks my door at night. The refrigerator has a lock on it, too. He took the cast off my arm himself because he said doctors ask questions. She said it the way she'd rehearsed it. Probably. Flat, factual, the emotion removed because emotion had gotten her nowhere 11 times already. What he didn't know yet was what came next. 3 weeks ago, I heard him on the phone. He said same as with Tammy. I don't know who Tammy is, but he also said the farm closes November 14th, and after that I go to Clarksburg. She paused. I counted. That's 31 days. She said it with the matter-of-fact clarity of a child who has sat alone in a locked room counting tiles and days and the exact number of words in a conversation heard through a 2-inch gap under a door, repeating them to herself every night so they wouldn't disappear. Virgil Cole stayed very still. The refrigerator padlock, the crooked arm. Same as with Tammy. November 14th, 31 days. He had spent 6 years doing CPS intake before the job turned his stomach inside out, and he quit. He had seen fabricated documentation, staged home visits, children transferred out of placements on timelines that suspiciously coincided with court filings. He knew what he was looking at. He had known it, in fact, the moment he read the note. But knowing it in your gut, and hearing a 7-year-old recite a phone conversation she'd memorized through a door crack because it was the only evidence she had, those were 2 different things, and the second one did something to the space behind his sternum that had no name. He heard the door to the laundromat open. He stood up. Not fast. Deliberately. "Stay here," he said. "Right here. I'm going to have a conversation outside. Don't move and don't make noise. Can you do that?" She looked at him, nodded once. He walked toward the front of the laundromat. Douglas Merritt was already inside. What happened next was not a confrontation. Not yet. It was something colder, two men taking each other's measure in the fluorescent hum of an empty laundromat at 10 o'clock at night, while a 7-year-old girl sat behind a dryer counting the seconds. Merritt had the presentation of a man who handled situations. Fleece vest, reading glasses on a lanyard, the specific, unhurried energy of someone accustomed to being believed. He said something about Addie having grief episodes. He said something about the county foster board. He said, with practiced warmth, that he appreciated the concern, but everything was fine. Virgil let him finish. Then he said, quietly, "She's not going with you tonight." The warmth in Merritt's face did not disappear. It just went through a recalibration so fast only someone looking for it would have caught it. He started to speak again. Virgil held up one hand. "You're welcome to call your attorney, or the county, or whoever you want to call." He kept his voice level. "But tonight she's not leaving with you. And while you're deciding what to do about that, I'm going to make a phone call of my own." He turned around and walked back to the far row without waiting for a response. Merritt stood there for 11 seconds. Virgil counted. Then he heard the laundromat door open and close. He crouched back down. Addie was exactly where he'd left her. "He's gone," Virgil said. "For now." "He'll come back with Officer Murch," she said. "He always does." "Then we have maybe 20 minutes. He reached into his cut and took out his phone. He held it up so she could see the screen, see him dial, see that he wasn't calling anyone she needed to be afraid of. He looked at her. "Is it okay if I call some people I trust?" She looked at his hands. Then she looked at his face for the first time, really looked the way she'd been avoiding since he found her. She nodded. He dialed. The call lasted 43 seconds. "Crowbar. It's War Chief." "What's going on?" "Laundromat on Lafayette. I need you, Brimstone, Halftone, Razorback. And get Gravel. Tell him to bring his pickup, not his bike. We've got a child, 7 years old, and we've got approximately 20 minutes before a man comes back here with a badge he already owns." He paused. "Pull everything you can find on a Douglas Ray Merritt, Wetzel County DHHR, licensed foster coordinator, guardian of record for a girl named Addie Mae Pruett, Farm Trust in Wetzel County, probate, November 14th closing." A half-second of silence. "Say no more. We're coming." The line went dead. Virgil put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at Addie, who had been watching his face during the entire call. "Some friends of mine are on their way," he said. "They're going to look a little scary. Some of them have tattoos on their necks. One of them is very large and very loud, and means absolutely no harm to anyone who doesn't deserve it." He held her gaze. "None of them are going to hurt you. I give you my word on that." She considered this with the seriousness of a child who had learned to evaluate promises on the evidence of past performance. "What kind of friends?" she said. "The kind who show up," he said. "Every time." She looked down at the note in her lap. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks. She looked back up at him. "Okay," she said. She said it like someone who had been waiting a very long time to say it, and was not entirely sure they were allowed. They arrived in 14 minutes. You might be picturing what 14 minutes usually means when 70-plus Hells Angels mobilize in the middle of the night. You might be imagining the roar, the chaos, the swarm of leather and chrome descending on a coin laundromat, like something out of a movie, rage-fueled, loud, a force that breaks things first and asks questions afterward. That is not what happened. That is not who these men were. The first to arrive was Marcus Webb, who went by Crowbar, 51 years old, 9 years as a WVDHHR intake investigator before he turned in his badge in disgust and found better brotherhood than the state could offer him. He walked in quiet, sat down on the bench nearest the door, and did not look toward the back row until War Chief came to him. He carried a laptop in a battered messenger bag and had it open before he sat down. Brimstone came next. Earl Dawson, 64, retired Wetzel County Circuit Court clerk, 22 years. He wore reading glasses of his own and carried a manila folder he had evidently pulled from somewhere in the previous 12 minutes. He shook War Chief's hand without speaking and immediately began writing on a notepad. Halftone. Kevin Park, 38, former Charleston Gazette investigative reporter who'd left when his editor killed the story he'd spent 8 months building, came in with his phone already recording audio and his eyes already moving around the room cataloging details. He'd been pulling Douglas Merritt's County Fair Committee financials since the moment the call came in. Razorback, Denny Holt, 55, retired WV State Police with 17 years at the Moundsville Post, stopped inside the door and stood very still for a long moment. He knew this laundromat. He knew this street. He knew the name Douglas Merritt, the way you know a name that has come up adjacent to something you couldn't prove. And last, Thomas Kane, who went by Gravel, 72 years old, founding member of the Logan County chapter, former coal miner, father of 4, and grandfather of 11. He parked his pickup out front, walked in, saw the small yellow raincoat visible at the end of the far row, and walked toward it. He sat down on the floor, not in a chair, on the floor, at a respectful distance. He didn't speak. He didn't ask anything. He just sat. He put his hands in his lap, palms up, the same gesture War Chief had made, because some gestures travel between people who have learned the same language. Addie looked at him for a long time. Then she scooted 4 inches closer. It was not much. It was everything. While Gravel sat with Addie, War Chief stood with his 4 brothers in the front section of the laundromat and gave them the facts. He spoke for 6 minutes. He did not editorialize. He told them the note, the bracelet, the overheard conversation. November 14th, Clarksburg, same as with Tammy. He told them about the refrigerator lock and the crooked arm, and the 3 times the system had been handed this child and returned her. When he finished, Crowbar looked up from his laptop. Douglas Ray Merritt, licensed foster care coordinator, certified 2018. I did the certification seminar he attended. He said it without inflection. 3 prior placements, all ended in transfers he filed himself. Placement instability cited in all 3. No investigations opened on any of them. Who approved the guardianship? Brimstone said, already writing. Probate Court, Judge Harold Sims, filed 8 days after the Pruett parents died, approved in 4 days. Crowbar looked up. Standard processing is 3 to 6 weeks. The fluorescent hum, the uneven thump of the last dryer turning on its cycle. The farm, War Chief said. I'm pulling the Wetzel County deed records now, Halftone said. Give me 3 minutes. Brimstone looked at his notepad. If the farm closes November 14th and he files a transfer the following week, there is a window, a narrow one, to file an emergency petition with the probate court before the deed transfers. We need to get to Judge Enlow." "Patricia Enlow," Razorback said slowly. "She and I sat on the same county safety committee 5 years ago. She's been uneasy about Sims's probate approvals for a long time. She just hasn't had a reason." "She's about to have one," Brimstone said. The door to the laundromat opened. Officer Dale Murch walked in. What he found was not what he expected. He expected chaos, or confrontation, or at minimum a situation that gave him something to report back to Douglas Merritt. What he found was a coin laundromat, where 5 men in leather vests were seated quietly in the front section, one of them typing on a laptop, one taking notes on a legal pad, one reading something on his phone. At the back of the room, an old man with white hair and a coal country face was sitting on the floor next to a small child who was showing him the ceiling tiles she had been counting. Murch stopped inside the door. Razorback stood up. Slowly, he walked to within 6 feet of Murch and stopped. "Dale," he said. The color left Officer Dale Murch's face in approximately 1 second. "Denny," he said. 17 years you and I worked this post," Razorback said. 7 weeks ago, a 7-year-old girl walked into your precinct and told you her guardian was putting his hands on her. You called him to come pick her up, and you didn't file a single piece of paper." The dryer thumped. The fluorescent light buzzed. "I didn't," Murch started. "You did," Razorback said. "And right now I don't have time to talk about why. But here's what I need you to understand. This child is not leaving this building with Douglas Merritt tonight. If you try to make that happen, everything I've just told you becomes part of a documented record that Halfton over there is putting together right now. If you leave, come back in the morning, and let the legal process that Brimstone is filing tonight run its course." He paused. "We don't have to talk about what happened 7 weeks ago. Ever." Murch stood in the doorway for a long moment. He left without a word. The door swung closed. Warchief looked at Razorback. Razorback sat back down and picked up his coffee. Addie watched from the far row as Gravel stood up gently and walked her toward the front. She kept her yellow coat on. She kept her hands inside her sleeves. She moved the way she always moved. Quiet, close to walls, reading every room before committing to it. She stopped when she reached the bench where Crowbar was working. She looked at the laptop screen, then at him. "You worked for the state," she said. It was not a question. Crowbar looked up. Something in his face recalibrated. "I did. Did you help kids like me?" "I tried to," he said after a moment. "Not always well enough." She considered this. Then she sat down on the bench next to him, still not touching, still with that inch of cautionary space, and looked at the screen. "Is that about Douglas?" she said. "It is." "Is it bad?" "It is," Crowbar said again, "but that's good for you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He said same as with Tammy, 3 weeks ago. I've been saying it to myself every night so I wouldn't forget." She looked at Crowbar. "Who is Tammy?" The 4 brothers looked at each other across the laundromat. Warchief crouched to her level. "Tammy's going to matter tonight," he said. "You're going to matter tonight. The date doesn't change anything. 31 days is 31 days, and we've moved faster than that. You came to the right person." He reached into his cut. He took out his phone and held it up so she could see the screen. "I'm going to make a few more calls," he said. "Is that okay?" She looked at his hands. She looked at the door. She looked at the hospital bracelet she had transferred back to her wrist. The faded barcode, the only record for 9 weeks that any one official had seen her at all. Then she nodded. And War Chief began to work. By 11:15 p.m., 31 Logan County brothers had parked their motorcycles in the overflow lot across Route 2 from Lucky Spin Laundromat. They did not park on the sidewalk. They did not block traffic. They did not rev their engines or make themselves loud. They pulled in one by one, engines cutting off in sequence, the sudden quiet after all that mechanical thunder settling over the street like something held. 31 men in identical cuts, sitting on their bikes in the dark, not moving. A man walking his dog on Lafayette Avenue stopped and stared. Then he put his phone away. He'd been halfway through dialing and kept walking. Because here is the thing about 73 Hells Angels arriving in disciplined formation at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in Moundsville, West Virginia. It looked nothing like what you'd expect. No chaos, no shouting. The coordinated efficiency of men who had ridden together for decades, who knew without being told which jobs needed doing and in what order. Military precision was the closest description, and several of them had earned the right to that comparison firsthand. Inside the laundromat, War Chief had divided the work into 4 tracks. Crowbar on financial records, pulling every document trail connected to Douglas Merritt, Merritt Property Holdings, LLC, the Wetzel County probate filing, and the estate account for Addie Mae Pruett. Brimstone on the legal filing, drafting the emergency guardian ad litem petition that needed to reach Judge Patricia Enlow's front door before the Wetzel County Courthouse opened at 8 a.m. He had 9 hours. He'd done this before in less. Half-tone on documentation, photographing everything, time-stamping everything, creating an evidentiary record that would survive a courtroom. Razorback on the institutional side, working the phones, calling in 17 years of professional relationships at the Moundsville Post and beyond. And Gravel, Thomas Kane, 72 years old, founding member, former coal miner, grandfather of 11, sitting on a laundromat bench with Addie Mae Pruett at 11 o'clock at night, showing her how to fold a paper crane from a page torn from Brimstone's notepad because someone needed to, and he was the right man for it. There is something I want to say here, directly to you, before we go further. I have told a lot of these stories, and the question I get more than any other, in comments, in messages, from people who knew a child like Addie, or were a child like Addie, is some version of, why didn't anyone help sooner? It is a fair question. It is also, I have come to understand, the wrong one. The right question is, how does a man like Douglas Merritt exist inside a system designed to stop him? The answer is not that the system is full of evil people. It isn't. Caseworker Brenda Simcox was not evil. Officer Dale Murch was not evil. Mrs. Hale, Addie's teacher, was not evil. They were people operating inside structures that rewarded paperwork over instinct, documentation over observation, and the avoidance of conflict over the pursuit of truth. Douglas Merritt did not defeat the system through genius. He defeated it through familiarity. He had been trained by the same system he was exploiting. He knew every form, every threshold, every defensible response. He knew that a staged, clean house, plus a cooperative manner, plus a child deemed emotionally dysregulated from grief, added up to a closed case file every single time. He had done it before. That is the thing nobody in Moundsville knew yet. At 11:47 p.m., Crowbar looked up from his laptop. "War Chief," he said. "Come look at this." The room went quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet when the person who knows what they're looking at has stopped typing. Crowbar turned the laptop screen so the others could see. "Merritt Property Holdings, LLC," he said. "Registered in West Virginia, 2019. Single member. Sole officer, Douglas Ray Merritt. I've got 3 transactions in the estate account for Addie Pruett. $8,400 in 4 months, all listed as administrative expenses with no itemization. Here's the first one." He pointed. "Canaan Valley Resort. March. $3,800 listed as therapeutic respite, foster parent. Here's the second, a bass boat through a Clarksburg dealer, $2,200, listed as recreational therapy equipment. And here," he moved his finger, "kitchen renovation, $8,340 total, listed as home improvement for placement standards." The fluorescent light buzzed. "He's billing a 7-year-old orphan for his kitchen," Halftone said, not as a question. "Legally," Crowbar said. "That's the part that matters. As trustee, he has broad discretionary authority over estate funds for reasonable expenses related to the ward's welfare and placement. The definition of reasonable is whatever he can defend in front of a judge who approved his application in 4 days. Brimstone looked up from his legal pad. "Judge Harold Sims." "Who certified Douglas's training seminar?" Crowbar said. "I checked. Sims signed the continuing education certificate, 2020. The room absorbed that. Here is what I want you to understand about what Crowbar just described, because it matters and most people never learn how it works. When a child is left without parents, a probate court appoints a guardian, and separately a trustee to manage any assets. Those can be the same person. And in Addie's case, Douglas Merritt held both roles. A trustee has what's called fiduciary duty, a legal obligation to manage the assets in the beneficiary's interest, not their own. What Douglas was doing was called self-dealing, using trust funds for personal benefit while calling it guardian expenses. It is a crime. It just requires someone to look. The problem is that nobody looks unless someone asks them to. And in Wetzel County, the person positioned to ask those questions, Judge Harold Sims, had a reason not to. "We need to get this to Enloe tonight," Brimstone said, "before it goes to Sims's courtroom. If Sims sees this coming, he will find a way to delay the petition until after the farm closes." Razorback was already dialing. What Razorback found out, in a 12-minute conversation he will never fully describe, was that Patricia Enloe had been waiting for exactly this. She had been troubled by the speed of Harold Sims's approval of Douglas Merritt's guardianship for 11 months. She had flagged it internally. She had been told, by 2 different people in the courthouse administration, that Douglas Merritt was a valued contractor and community figure, and there was no reason to make things complicated. She had filed her concern in writing once through the appropriate channel. The appropriate channel was Harold Sims's office. The concern was not responded to. She told Razorback over the phone at 11:58 p.m. that if he could get a signed petition to her porch by 6 a.m., she would have it in front of the right people before the courthouse opened. "How?" War Chief asked. "She's been a circuit court judge for 14 years, Razorback said. "She knows which phone calls to make at 6 in the morning. "Brimstone," War Chief said. "I'll have it done by 3, Brimstone said, and picked up his pen. They went to Douglas Merritt's house at 1 a.m. Not all of them. 6. War Chief, Crowbar, Razorback, Halftone, and 2 Logan County brothers named Pike and Deacon, who had been outside in the cold for 2 hours without complaint. Addie was in Gravel's pickup, parked 2 streets over, with Gravel and 2 brothers who had not been told they were babysitting and had simply volunteered. The house at 114 Slater Hollow Road was a raised ranch on a half-acre. Vinyl siding, detached garage, a flower bed by the front steps that had clearly been landscaped for impression rather than love. The lights were on. They parked on the street. They walked up the driveway in the specific, unhurried way of men who have decided how this ends and are simply allowing the paperwork to catch up. War Chief knocked. Douglas Merritt opened the door in his reading glasses and a fleece vest, holding a mug of coffee, looking for all the world like a man who had been waiting, calmly, for exactly this visit. "Mr. Cole," he said. He already knew War Chief's name. He had been making calls since the laundromat. "Mr. Merritt," War Chief said, "we're going to need to come inside." What happened in the next 40 minutes was not, as people in Moundsville would later imagine, a confrontation driven by volume and threat. There was no table flipped, no walls put in, no one raised their voice at any point, including Douglas Merritt, right up until the moment he understood he had lost. Crowbar sat down at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. Halftone began documenting the room with a calm that Merritt clearly found more unsettling than anger. Razorback walked to the kitchen and looked at the refrigerator. The padlock was still on it. He photographed it without comment. War Chief stood in the center of the living room and looked at Douglas Merritt. Merritt set down his coffee. The shoulders dropped. Practiced move, a studied relaxation designed to communicate that he was the reasonable one in this room. He opened his hands, palms up. He had done this 1,000 times with caseworkers, judges, reporters. The gesture said, "I have nothing to hide, and the people accusing me are confused." "I understand there's been a misunderstanding tonight," he said. He had a warm voice. The specific warmth of someone who has learned that warmth is a tool. Addie has been struggling since her parents passed. Grief in children presents in ways that can look alarming to people who aren't trained to. "Mr. Merritt," War Chief said, "I spent 6 years doing CPS intake. Tell me something I haven't heard." The warmth recalibrated. 1 second. Half a second. Then it came back, smoother. "Then you know," Merritt said, "that children in acute grief present behaviors that can be misinterpreted by well-meaning—" "The refrigerator," War Chief said. "In your kitchen. The one with the padlock. What's that for?" The warmth held for 3 more seconds. Then it slipped. Not gone, just visibly working harder. "Security," Merritt said. "Addie has been known to eat at irregular hours. Her doctor recommended—" "Which doctor?" Crowbar said, without looking up from the laptop. "Doctor," Merritt started. "Because her medical records from W.V.U. Reynolds show no documented dietary restriction of any kind. The last entry is 9 weeks old. Pediatric fracture, left forearm, discharged with a cast. Cast is not currently on her arm." Crowbar looked up. "Who removed it?" The warmth stopped. Merritt tried the second lever. "I want to be very clear," he said, the measured voice going sharp around the edges, "that what you are doing right now constitutes unlawful detention. I have a relationship with the county administrator and the DHHR director, and I will have your club's charter under review before morning if you—" "Merritt Property Holdings, LLC," Halftone said from across the room, reading from his phone. "Registered 2019, 3 transactions from the Pruett estate account in 4 months, $8,400. Bass boat, kitchen renovation, resort deposit, all listed as guardian expenses. He looked up. The kitchen looks great, by the way. The word merit said next was not a threat. It was smaller than that. It was the sound of a calculation being run and coming back wrong. You don't have standing to access those records, he said. The FBI does, War Chief said. That word landed in the room the way the first real piece of evidence always lands when someone has been successfully deflecting for 11 months, like a door closing behind them. Merritt's face went through something that had no performance left in it. The shoulders that had been loose and open tightened. The hands that had been up went down. Something under the practiced surface broke the surface for exactly 1 second, raw and exposed. Not remorse, not guilt, but the specific cold panic of a man who has built an elaborate structure and just heard the foundation crack. I want my attorney, he said. Your attorney is welcome, War Chief said. The FBI is going to want to talk to them anyway. He found the folder in the office. He wasn't supposed to find it. He was in the office because Halftone had noticed a file cabinet with a legal tab marked Pruett Estate, and Crowbar had seen, below it, another tab in older paper, slightly yellowed. Kirsch T. Crowbar put on gloves. He opened the drawer. He pulled the Kirsch file and set it on the desk. Inside, a placement record. A child named Tammy Lynn Kirsch, 14 years old, placed with Douglas Ray Merritt, February 2020. A transfer form filed by Merritt in October 2021, citing placement instability. A runaway report filed by Merritt, dated 3 days after the transfer. A bank withdrawal receipt, $1,200 from a savings account, signed by Douglas Merritt as guardian, dated 2 weeks before the runaway report. And a stipend overpayment notice from VDHHR. 4 months of foster care payments totaling $7,400 received after Tammy Kirsch had been administratively marked as no longer in placement. Douglas Merritt had collected money for a child the state believed had run away, while simultaneously being the person who filed the report, saying she had run away. Crowbar set the papers down. He stood very still for a long moment. War Chief, he said. Everyone in the room heard something in his voice they had not heard before. Tammy Kirsch, Crowbar said, 14, 2020 to 2021. Reported as a runaway by Merritt. Last known location 4 miles from this house, 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. He paused. She was never found. The kitchen refrigerator hummed behind its padlock. Somewhere outside, a motorcycle idled and cut off. Nobody spoke. I have sat with this moment. The moment when a room understands that what it thought it was dealing with is something larger and older and more terrible than what it walked in to stop. Many times in the stories I tell. And every time, I want to say something that explains it, that gives it a frame that makes it bearable. I cannot. Some things do not have frames. What I can tell you is this. In 2021, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported over 360,000 missing children in the United States. Most were recovered quickly. Many were runaways. But a meaningful number, children like Tammy Lynn Kirsch, were listed as runaways based on a report filed by the last adult responsible for them. And without a body, without a witness, without evidence of foul play, those cases close. They close, and they sit in a filing cabinet in a house that is also supposed to be a home. and nobody opens them again until a different child survives long enough to remember a phone conversation through a 2-inch gap under a door. Tammy Kirsch was 14. Addie Pruett was 7. The only difference between them, in this specific moment, was that Addie had carried a note for 3 weeks and found the right person. War Chief walked to where Douglas Merritt was sitting in his living room. He sat down across from him. He did not lean forward. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Merritt the way a man looks at something he has decided how to handle. "Tell me about Tammy," he said. Merritt looked at the folder in Crowbar's hand. The performance was over. What was left was something smaller and rawer. Not honesty, not quite, but the particular desperation of a man whose options have narrowed to one. "I want my attorney," he said again. Quieter this time. "Your attorney," War Chief said, "is going to have a very interesting morning." He stood up. He looked at Razorback. "Call it in," he said. At 2:17 a.m., War Chief drove to an address in friendly West Virginia, a small town on the Ohio River, 40 minutes south, and knocked on the door of Kevin Merritt, age 43, Douglas's younger brother. Kevin Merritt answered the door in a t-shirt and sweatpants, blinking against the porch light, and looked at the man standing in front of him the way a person looks when they have been waiting for a knock. They have been dreading for a year and a half. "You heard the call," War Chief said. It was not a question. Kevin Merritt looked at his hands. "I didn't know about Tammy," he said. "I thought she ran away. That's what Doug said." "Tell me what you did know." Kevin sat down on his porch steps, just sat in the cold, in his t-shirt, as if standing up was no longer something his body was willing to do. He talked for 34 minutes. He told War Chief about the phone call Addie had overheard. He confirmed every word. He told him about the LLC, the farm contract, the management fee. He told him that he had believed, or chosen to believe, that what Douglas was doing was financial fraud and nothing worse. He told him that when he heard the name Tammy Kirsch again tonight, not from War Chief, from a voicemail Douglas had left at 11 p.m., instructing him to say nothing to anyone, something in him broke. "He said same as with Tammy," Kevin said. "On that call with me, I thought he meant—" He stopped. "I thought he meant transferring her out before anyone got attached. Moving the asset, moving the child. That's how Doug talks about them. The asset." His voice was not performing anything. It was just what it was. "You knew something was wrong," War Chief said. "Yes," Kevin said. "I told myself I didn't." There is a kind of person that every story like this contains. Not the predator, not the hero, but the person in the middle. The one who knew enough to act and found a reason not to. Kevin Merritt was not a monster. He was something harder to make sense of. An ordinary man who looked at his brother's life and saw the parts that benefited him and chose not to examine the rest. I don't tell you this to excuse him. I tell you because I think most of us, if we are honest, have done a version of this, have seen something we weren't sure about and told ourselves it wasn't our place, have heard something that didn't quite add up and decided it was probably nothing. The Kevins of the world are not rare. That's the part that should keep us up at night. Kevin Merritt signed a written statement at 2:58 a.m. He did it at his own kitchen table, with his hands shaking, and he did not stop writing until War Chief told him it was enough. At 5:43 a.m., a car pulled up outside Cole's garage on Route 2, where the Logan County chapter had relocated to work through the night. A woman in her mid-50s, no badge visible, plain clothes, the kind of exhaustion in her face that did not come from one missed night of sleep. She was FBI Special Agent Lena Torres, out of the Pittsburgh field office. She had been building a case on WEVDHHR contractor fraud for 8 months. She had a financial trail, a compliance audit, and a list of names that kept leading her back to Wetzel County. What she did not have was a living child willing to testify, documented physical evidence from inside a current placement, or the name Tammy Lynn Kirsch connected to anything with legal weight. She had heard about the activity in Moundsville at 2 a.m. from a contact at the Moundsville PD, who had been watching Razorback's phone calls with professional anxiety. She had driven 2 hours. She walked into Cole's garage and looked around at the evidence spread across 3 folding tables. She looked at Crowbar's laptop. She looked at the Kirsch file. She looked at the photograph of the padlocked refrigerator. She looked at the financial records showing $8,400 in unsupported estate disbursements. She picked up her pen and set it back down. "How long has your office known about Merritt?" War Chief asked. Torres didn't look away. 7 months? We got her out in 6 hours. You had 7 months. The garage was quiet, except for the sound of someone's coffee cooling. Torres had no good answer. She did not try to manufacture one. "We were building a prosecutable case," she said. "We needed charges that would hold. You move too fast, you lose the conviction." "She had 31 days before the farm closed," War Chief said. "If nobody found that note—" "I know," Torres said it quietly. "I know. The system is not broken. That's the thing I keep coming back to every time I tell one of these stories. A broken system could be repaired. This one works exactly as it was designed. It moves deliberately, it demands proof, it protects against false accusation, it requires documentation that holds up under cross-examination. Those are not bad things. Every one of them exists because someone, somewhere, was wrongly accused and their life was destroyed by a fast-moving system that didn't wait for evidence. But a child like Addie doesn't have 7 months. She has 31 days. She has a padlock on the kitchen and a door that locks from the outside, and the knowledge, memorized word for word, that she is not the first. The bikers did not replace the system. They bought the time the system needed to work. Torres looked at the evidence on the tables. "What do you need from us?" War Chief said. "A victim advocate," Torres said, "assigned before anyone talks to the child. Nobody approaches her without her consent. And the secondary arrest." She paused. "Harold Sims, the probate judge. I need your documentation on the 4-day approval connected to my financial trail. That one happens today, not after a week of paperwork." War Chief looked at her for a long moment. "You do right by her," he said. A beat. "That's the job," Torres said. At 6:04 a.m., Brimstone handed a sealed envelope to a woman at a front door on Quincy Street in New Martinsville. The woman took it without a word, looked at the seal, looked at Brimstone, and closed the door. At 7:12 a.m., Judge Patricia Enlow called a number in the West Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals that she had used twice in 22 years of practice. At 8:03 a.m., the Wetzel County Probate Court opened and immediately received an emergency filing challenging the sale of the Pruett estate property to Merritt Property Holdings, LLC, citing conflict of interest, breach of fiduciary duty, and a pending federal investigation. At 8:17 a.m., a second filing landed on Judge Harold Sims's desk. This one was from the federal level. It was not addressed to him. It was addressed to the court administrator, with a copy marked for the state Supreme Court. It concerned the expedited approval of a guardianship application in November of the previous year. It contained Crowbar's documented timeline of the approval process alongside the signed testimony of Kevin Merritt. At 8:59 a.m., Judge Harold Sims called in sick. He did not return to the bench for the remainder of his career. Douglas Ray Merritt was arrested at 10:41 a.m. He was in his front yard when the vehicles pulled up. He was watering the flower bed by the front steps with a green plastic watering can. He had dressed carefully: khakis, button-down, fleece vest, reading glasses on their lanyard. He looked exactly like a man who had decided that appearing normal was still a viable strategy. He set the watering can down on the porch steps when he saw the FBI vehicles. He put his hands in his pockets. He said, in a reasonable voice, that he assumed this was about the incident the previous night, and he was happy to cooperate fully with any investigation, and he had already called his attorney who would be. Agent Torres read him his rights in his front driveway. He asked once, quietly, if someone could call his neighbor about his mail. As if the world he had built, and the world he had destroyed, could wait while he sorted out his correspondence. The charges filed that morning: embezzlement from a protected person, breach of fiduciary duty, obstruction of a child welfare investigation, filing a false report, and fraud in the administration of a guardianship. The federal charges, related to the pattern of foster care stipend fraud, were filed separately. And a seventh charge, the one that would take an additional 6 weeks to build, but would ultimately carry the most weight: suspected involvement in the disappearance of a minor, Tammy Lynn Kirsch, whose case was formally reopened that afternoon by the West Virginia State Police Cold Case Unit. He was not granted bail at the initial hearing. The prosecutor cited flight risk and the active federal investigation. His attorney argued. The judge, not Sims, who was now himself the subject of a judicial conduct review, looked at the full charge sheet for a long moment and denied the motion. At the scope summary presented to Agent Torres at noon. 2 confirmed victims, 1 active and 1 under investigation. Total documented fraud from the Pruett estate: $8,400, with an additional $68,000 in anticipated fraudulent gain from the farm sale, now frozen. Stipend fraud from the Kirsch placement: $7,400. The Kirsch investigation pending, timeline potentially extending to 2019. Additional DHHR placements, flagged for review: 3. The number nobody said out loud, but that every person in that room was doing the arithmetic on: how many children had passed through Douglas Merritt's licensed placements since he was certified in 2018. The answer was 19. 19 children. How many of them had told someone and had the name Douglas Merritt used against them as armor? Nobody yet knew. They were going to find out. Addie Mae Pruett ate breakfast at 7:43 a.m. in the back office of Cole's Garage on Route 2. It was scrambled eggs, toast with butter, and orange juice in a paper cup. Gravel had driven to the 24-hour gas station on Jefferson Avenue at 6 a.m. and come back with everything he could carry in a brown paper bag. He had not asked her what she wanted. He had bought one of everything that seemed like it might be right for a 7-year-old, which meant the back office table also contained a bag of pretzels, a granola bar, a small bag of gummy bears, and a banana that she would not eat but would carry in her coat pocket for the next 3 days as a private reserve against uncertainty. She sat in a rolling office chair that was too big for her, both feet not reaching the floor, the yellow raincoat still on, and she ate. Nobody watched her eat. That was the thing she would remember longest. In the Merritt house, meals had been events. Watched, timed, adjudicated. Green days and yellow days and red days, and the specific performance of eating correctly under observation. Here, Gravel had set the plate down in front of her, and then turned around and started doing something with a coffee maker and a filter, his broad back to her, and she had understood without being told that she was allowed to eat in private. She ate every bite of the eggs. She ate the toast. She drank the orange juice. Then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, and she counted the ceiling tiles. 12. Same as the laundromat. She stopped counting. She didn't need to. Wrecker. Jimmy Solis, 39, active EMT out of Rutherford County, who had driven 3 hours in the night and arrived at the garage at 5 a.m., came into the back office at 8:15 with a first aid kit and the specific, gentle efficiency of someone who has learned how to enter a room without startling the person in it. "My name's Jimmy," he said. He didn't use his road name with her. "I'm a medic. I work in a hospital sometimes. Do you mind if I look at your arm?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled back her left sleeve. He looked at the healed forearm for a long time without speaking. The bone had fused in a slight outward rotation. What happened when a spiral fracture was immobilized inadequately and prematurely freed? It would not cause permanent disability. It would require intervention, re-imaging, a specialist consult, possibly a corrective procedure in 12 to 18 months, depending on growth. It would heal. Children's bones were stubborn and forgiving in ways that adult bones were not. He told her all of this. Not in clinical language, in plain language, the kind you use with a 7-year-old who has already been lied to by enough adults who used professional language as camouflage. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, "when it's cold." "It's going to get fixed," he said. "Not all at once, but it's going to get fixed." She looked at him. "How do you know?" she said. "Because War Chief said so," Wrecker said. "And War Chief doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She thought about this. She pulled her sleeve back down. "Okay," she said. I want to pause here for a moment, because this scene, a 39-year-old tattooed EMT in a Hell's Angels cut, sitting across a folding table from a malnourished 7-year-old in a yellow raincoat, explaining bone growth in simple terms, is the scene that the people who fear men like Jimmy Solis will never see. The people who cross the street, who move their children to the other side of the sidewalk, who read the patch on the vest and decide they already know what's underneath it. They are not wrong to be cautious. The world is full of people whose appearances are exactly what they suggest. But the world is also full of Jimmy Solises. Men who became something frightening looking for reasons that had nothing to do with wanting to frighten people, and who carry inside that frightening exterior a competence and a gentleness that most people never get close enough to discover. Addie Mae Pruett got close enough. The medical evaluation happened at VU Medicine Reynolds Memorial Hospital at 10 a.m. Wrecker drove her. He sat in the waiting room with a paper cup of terrible coffee and a motorcycle magazine he wasn't reading. And he was there when she came out. The attending pediatrician, Dr. Elena Vasquez, was thorough. She was also, as she told Recker quietly in the hallway afterward, deeply shaken in the specific way that pediatric physicians become shaken when they see a case that should have reached them months earlier. BM 13.9 Moderate malnutrition, approaching the threshold for severe. The improperly healed forearm fracture, as Recker had identified. 3 healing contusion sites consistent with blunt force impact. Chronic dehydration indicators in her blood work. And something Dr. Vasquez described in her report with clinical precision and described to Recker in plain language. The specific pattern of a child who had been systematically conditioned to minimize pain and need, because expressing pain and need had historically made things worse. "How long?" Recker asked. "At the rate of deterioration I'm seeing in her blood work," Dr. Vasquez said. "She had 3 to 4 weeks before we would have been looking at organ stress indicators. Kidneys first, then cardiac." She paused. "Whoever got her out of that house last night?" she said. She didn't finish the sentence. She looked at Recker's cut, his road name, the Logan County patch. "Thank you," she said, "for getting her here when you did." Recker nodded once. He did not trust his voice. "The treatment plan: inpatient monitoring for 48 hours, nutritional rehabilitation protocol, orthopedic consult scheduled, trauma-informed counseling referral. A victim advocate, assigned by FBI agent Torres per the partnership terms, was present for every institutional interaction from this point forward. Her name was Deborah Haynes, and she had been doing this work for 19 years, and she sat with Addie during the doctor's visit and did not once speak for Addie, or over Addie, or instead of Addie. She simply stayed. Addie, it turned out, found this acceptable. The housing question was answered by Edna Cornett. Edna was 72 years old, had lived on Pruett Road for 31 years, 3/10 of a mile from the farm where Addie had been born, and had been watching from across a field for 11 months, with a guilt that had settled into her body like a slow injury. She had filed the anonymous tip. She had received the attorney's letter. She had stood at her kitchen window on the day of the DHHR visit and watched Douglas Merritt wait 10 minutes in his driveway before going back inside. And she had known with a certainty that lived below language what that 10 minutes meant. And she had done nothing with that knowledge because the letter from the attorney had said defamation and legal action, and the only thing standing between Edna and those words was a landline phone and a conscience that kept her up most nights. When Crowbar called her at 8 a.m., she answered on the first ring. "I've been waiting," she said, "for someone to call me." She drove to the hospital that afternoon. She sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes before Deborah Haynes came out and explained gently that they would need to ask Addie first. Edna said, "Of course, whatever she needs." Addie remembered Mrs. Cornett. She had been the woman who watched her after school when her parents worked late. She had a porch with a swing and a cookie tin that was always full, and a dog named Clarence who slept on the couch. She was the last safe place Addie had known before everything changed. When Deborah asked if she would be willing to see her, Addie was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Is Clarence still alive?" Deborah said she didn't know. "Can you find out?" Addie said. Clarence was alive. 11 years old, arthritic, still sleeping on the couch. Addie agreed to see Edna Cornett. They sat together for 20 minutes. Nobody else in the room. Edna cried. Addie handed her a tissue from the box on the nightstand, with the matter-of-fact practicality of a child who had learned to manage adult emotions. Then, after a while, Addie leaned against Edna's shoulder the way she had leaned against her on the porch swing 3 years ago, when her parents were still alive, and the worst thing that had happened that week was a skinned knee. Edna's house had a spare bedroom. It had been her daughter's room, empty for 6 years. The Logan County chapter covered the first 4 months of Addie's care costs, while the legal process arranged the permanent solution, a total of $14,200 raised in 9 days from 31 chapters across 3 states. The fundraising post had been written by Halftone, who knew exactly which details to include and which to leave for the courts, and it had been shared 11,000 times by the end of the first week. The foster care arrangement was formalized through Judge Patricia Enlow's court, not Sims's, in a process that took 6 weeks and was, by all accounts, conducted with a thoroughness that Judge Sims's court had never managed. Edna passed every check. The room was inspected. The arrangement was approved. The key was a standard house key on a small ring with a daisy keychain that had belonged to Edna's daughter. She handed it to Addie in the courthouse parking lot on a Thursday morning in late November, the Ohio River visible through the trees, the first hard frost of the season white on the grass. Addie held it for a moment. Then she put it in her coat pocket, in the same place where the note had been. The brothers said goodbye in the Coles garage parking lot on the afternoon of October 16th, 2 days after the laundromat. They came one at a time, the way these things go when men have been raised to believe that emotions are entitled to privacy. Halftone gave her his phone number, written on a piece of paper, and then his card, and then said he'd written it in her phone too, just to be safe. He shook her hand with complete seriousness, like a transaction between equals. Brimstone told her, formally, that the probate court petition had been granted. The farm sale was frozen, and her estate was now under the supervision of a court-appointed independent trustee with no connection to Douglas Merritt or Harold Sims. He said this in exactly the language he would have used with an adult. She listened with exactly the attention she would have given to something she understood. Whether she understood the legal specifics mattered less than the fact that he had respected her enough to tell her the truth directly. Razorback said nothing. He nodded at her. She nodded back. It was a complete exchange. Crowbar crouched down. He was the one she had sat next to in the laundromat, the one who had pulled the records in real time while she watched. He looked at her for a moment. "You memorized that conversation," he said. "Every word, for 3 weeks." "I was afraid I'd forget," she said. "You didn't." He held her gaze. "That mattered. That's what broke it open. Not us. You. We just knew what to do with what you gave us." She thought about this. "Okay," she said. And last was gravel. Thomas Kane, 72, founding member, coal miner, 11 grandchildren. He came out of the garage, wiping his hands on a shop rag, and he stood in front of her and didn't say anything for a moment. He was enormous in the specific way of men who have done physical work their entire lives, and his face had the landscape of someone who had spent decades in the dark making decisions that kept other people safe. He took something out of his jacket pocket. It was a folded piece of paper. Notebook paper, torn from Brimstone's legal pad. He had spent the 2 hours of Addie's hospital visit folding it. It was a paper crane, the one he had started showing her in the laundromat. He set it in her palm. "You finished the counting," he said. When you're ready. No hurry. She looked at the crane. She closed her hand around it carefully, the way you hold something small and made from nothing that you don't want to crush. Thank you, she said. He put his large, scarred, coal-stained hand briefly on the top of her head, not pressing, just resting, the way you put a hand on a fence post to check if it's solid. And then he walked back inside. This story isn't about motorcycles. It isn't about patches or road names or the particular mythology that has grown up around men who choose to live outside the edges of ordinary life. It's about a child who carried a note for 3 weeks. Because she had been failed so many times, she had stopped trusting words and started trusting paper. It's about a system that is staffed, largely, by people who mean well and are given frameworks that move too slowly for the children trapped inside them. It's about the specific kind of evil that wears community standing as armor, that learns the language of care and uses it as cover, that operates most effectively in exactly the environments designed to stop it. And it's about what happens when someone, one person, chooses not to put their earbuds back in. 6 weeks after that night, Addie Mae Pruett slept with the lights off for the first time. Edna didn't know until the morning. She'd been leaving the hall light on. The door cracked. The specific geography of a house arranged to say, "You are not alone in the dark." But when she got up at 6:15 to let Clarence out and walked past the spare room, the crack under the door was dark. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Clarence pushed his gray muzzle against her leg. She went downstairs and started the coffee. Addie came down at 7, in the too large sweatshirt that had appeared in the donated clothing bag and that she had immediately claimed as her own. She sat at the kitchen table. Clarence put his head in her lap. She put a piece of toast on the table and ate it one corner at a time, looking out the window at the frost on the field. Edna did not say anything about the lights. She poured 2 glasses of orange juice and set one down. The toast was not portioned. The refrigerator was not locked. There was no chart on the wall. Addie ate the whole piece. Then she tore off a corner of her second piece and held it under the table. Clarence took it with enormous dignity. "He's not supposed to have bread," Edna said. "I know," Addie said. Neither of them said anything else. The coffee maker finished. Outside, the Ohio River caught the first flat light of a November morning. War Chief drove past the Cornett house on Route 2 3 weeks after that. He wasn't going anywhere specific. It was a Sunday morning, cold and clear, the kind of West Virginia morning that made you understand why people stayed. He slowed down. Through the front window, visible from the road, he could see the kitchen light on, a small figure at the kitchen table, an old dog moving along the baseboard, a woman setting down a mug. He didn't stop. He didn't have a reason to stop. Everything that needed doing had been done. He pulled his collar up and rode. 14 months later, in a community center meeting room in Moundsville, a woman named Sandra Tolliver stood up in front of 19 people, foster parents, social workers, 2 DHHR supervisors, and 1 circuit court judge who had driven 40 minutes because she thought it mattered, and said the thing she had been building the language for since October. She was 31. She had been in foster care herself from age 8 to 18. She had a degree in social work and a job she had quit 8 months ago, and a new job she had started 6 months ago, working for a non-profit focused on exactly the gap that had nearly killed Addie Pruett. She had one photograph on the table in front of her. It was a picture of a grocery store shelf, a row of combination padlocks. She had taken it on the day she read the case summary in the local paper. She had taken it because she needed to remember what ordinary objects looked like when they were used as weapons. "There are children in this county right now," she said, "who have told someone. They told their teacher. They told a police officer. They told a neighbor. And every single time, the adult they told found the path of least resistance, which was the phone number listed as the emergency contact, which was the abuser's number, because we built our system that way." She looked around the room. The Addie Pruett case changed one thing immediately and one thing slowly. The immediate thing was the way the Wetzel County HR processes emergency contact information for foster placements. Every child now has a minimum of 2 contacts, one of which must be independent of the placement household. That took 4 weeks to implement. It should have been policy in 1994. The slow thing, she explained, was harder to quantify. It was the thing that happened when 19 people in a meeting room heard a story clearly and decided to carry it with them. "You don't need 73 motorcycles," she said. "You need to not put your earbuds back in." The room was quiet. One of the DHHR supervisors wrote something on her notepad. The circuit court judge looked at the window for a moment, with an expression that had nothing professional left in it. 2 of the foster parents were holding each other's hands. Later, Sandra would describe this meeting as the first one where she felt the room actually change. Not agree, not nod, not move on to the next agenda item. Change. 3 months after that meeting, the Dubu VD-HHR piloted a new child welfare protocol in 5 counties, a mandatory secondary review process for any foster placement that ended in a guardian-initiated transfer. It required an independent caseworker to interview the child, alone, without the guardian present, before the transfer could be processed. It was called the Pruett Review. Nobody asked Addie if they could use her name. She found out from Edna, who read about it in the Moundsville Daily, and showed her the article over breakfast. Addie read it twice. "They spelled my name right," she said. "They did," Edna said. Addie folded the paper and put it next to her orange juice. "Good," she said. She was 11 years old when she walked into a public library in New Martinsville on a Tuesday afternoon in March and found a girl. The girl was 9. She was in the magazine section, which was where Addie had used to go because it was easy to stay for a long time there, without anyone asking what you were doing. She was small in a way that was more than her age. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt in March. She was sitting with her back to the wall and her eyes on every exit. Addie sat down in the chair across from her. Not too close. The girl looked at her hands. Addie had learned, 4 years ago, that some people looked at hands first because hands were what told you what was coming. She put her hands flat on the table, palms up, open. "My name's Addie," she said. "I used to come here a lot too." The girl looked up. "The woman at the desk," Addie said. "Her name is Mrs. Garland. She doesn't ask questions. If you need to stay for a while, she'll just let you." The girl was quiet. "I know what it feels like," Addie said, "when you've tried to tell people and it didn't work. I'm not going to tell you to tell someone. I'm just going to sit here, if that's okay, until you decide what you want to do." She had a backpack. Inside it, her phone, a granola bar, old habit, never quite broke it, and a folded piece of paper with 2 phone numbers on it. One was a hotline. One was Sandra Tolliver's cell phone. She set the piece of paper on the table. not pushed toward the girl, just on the table. She recognized the look. She had worn it for 11 months. She knew it from the inside, that combination of terror and hope and exhaustion, the face of someone who has been failed enough times to stop expecting anything but hasn't quite given up yet. She had not quite given up yet. That was the only reason she was sitting in a library in Moundsville in October, 4 years ago, when a man in a Hell's Angels cut reached for a dryer handle, and his hand stopped. She didn't walk past. She didn't tell herself it wasn't her problem. She sat with her palms on the table, and she waited for the girl across from her to decide. The corner booth at Lucky Spin Laundromat on Lafayette Avenue, Moundsville, West Virginia. Tuesday night. Virgil Cole sat in the chair closest to the far row of dryers, the same chair he'd been sitting in for 11 years on Tuesdays, and he drank the coffee he'd brought in a thermos because the vending machine coffee tasted like the inside of a car engine. The machines ran their cycles. The fluorescent light buzzed. The rain came in off the Ohio and hit the plate glass the same way it always did in November. He had a folder on the table in front of him, a plain manila folder with a piece of tape on the tab. He'd written on the tape in permanent marker, in his own handwriting, "Why We Ride." Inside, not official documents, not case files, messages, 211 of them, printed on regular paper, folded once, accumulated over 4 years. Messages from strangers who had seen the story and written to the Logan County chapter contact address. Messages from people in other states who had recognized something in the story, a name, a padlock, a behavior chart on a kitchen wall, a guardian who brought flowers to school the day after. Messages from people who had been Addie once and had not found the right person. Messages from people who had found someone. There was a new one, printed that morning. A message from a social worker in Fayette County who had used the Pruett review process to catch a placement irregularity 4 months ago. The child was safe. The guardian was under investigation. She wanted him to know. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in the folder with the others. He looked at the gap between the last dryer and the wall. His son Marcus had been 6 years old when Virgil shipped out. He had been 9 when Virgil came home to a death certificate. A group home outside Clarksburg, pneumonia untreated, a closed case file that never explained why a treatable illness had been allowed to become fatal. 22 years had passed, and he still carried it the way you carry a stone in a shoe. Not always feeling it, but always aware of the possibility. He had asked himself, in the years since Addie, whether what he did that October night was about Marcus. He had decided the answer was, not exactly. Or maybe, not anymore. What he had understood, sitting on a linoleum floor with his palms flat and open, reading a note written by a child who had been carrying it for 3 weeks, was that some things were not about you and your history. Some things were simply about what was in front of you and what you were willing to do with the next 30 seconds. He had had 30 seconds. He had used them. The rest, he had learned, tended to follow from that. He closed the folder. He put it in his bag. He finished his coffee. He had been here 111 times now. The 101st was the one that changed something. He was not sure he would have predicted, back then, that it would still be changing things 4 years later, in Fayette County, in a library in New Martinsville, in a DHHR policy document with a name spelled correctly. Things spread the way things spread. You couldn't always trace the root, you could just keep riding. He put on his jacket. He picked up his bag. He walked to the door and held it open for a moment, looking back at the far row. The laundromat was empty. The dryers turned. The fluorescent light buzzed. He let the door close behind him and rode home through the November rain. If you have ever been Addie, if you have ever held a note in your hand that said, "Are you safe?" and been afraid to give it to anyone, I want you to know that the reason this story exists is because she gave it anyway, despite 11 failures, despite every adult who called the wrong number. She kept the note until she found the right person. If you have ever been the man with his hand on the dryer, the person who almost walked past, who had to decide in 30 seconds whether this was their problem, I want you to know that 30 seconds is enough. That's all it takes to change what happens next. And if you have ever been the one who put their earbuds back in, who heard something that didn't quite add up and decided it wasn't your place, I am not here to judge you. The world asks us to mind our own business so many times and in so many ways that it becomes a reflex. But reflexes can be unlearned. I've seen it happen. Pay attention. When a child hesitates before answering a simple question, notice it. When an adult speaks for a child in every setting where the child should speak for themselves, ask why. When something doesn't add up, the weight, the sleeves, the way they look at hands before faces, ask the uncomfortable question. You do not need to be certain. You do not need to be a professional. You need to be someone who decides that this child's 30 seconds matters more than your discomfort. There are Addies everywhere. In laundromats and libraries and school hallways and grocery stores and church fellowship halls and waiting rooms. They are counting ceiling tiles and watching hands and carrying folded pieces of paper they haven't found the right person to give to yet. Be the right person. If this story moved you, subscribe to Valiant Biker and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, and tell me about someone who showed up for you when you needed it. Or tell me about someone you showed up for. Those stories matter too, every one of them. And if you are in a situation right now that feels like Addie's, if you are the child or the adult who needs the number, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is 1-800-422-4453, available 24 hours a day. You don't have to carry the note alone. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. On a Tuesday night in October, in a coin laundromat on Lafayette Avenue in Moundsville, West Virginia, a 7-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat sat with her back to the wall and her knees to her chest and watched the door. She had been there for a while. She was very small and very cold, and she had 38 pounds of evidence that the world did not care whether she survived. And then a man's hand stopped on a dryer handle. And everything that came after, the petition, the frozen estate, the arrest, the reopened investigation, the policy named for her, the girl in the library 4 years later, with her palms on the table. All of it came from that one stopped hand. That is what a right person looks like. You already know how to be one.